I am honored to be joined today by General H.R. McMaster, who is the author of the new book, Battlegrounds, the Fight to Defend the Free World. He joins us from out at the Hoover Institution. Thanks so much, HR, for taking the time to join me today.
Hey, Ben, thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you.
I look forward to talking to you about a number of different things, but I have to start with this note that you have at the beginning of the book, which says flat out that this is not the book that a lot of people wanted you to write. Tell me a little bit why you felt the need to put that in there, because as soon as I opened your book, I just bust out laughing. and I said, well, that's the answer to that question right off the bat. Tell me why you put that in.
Well, Ben, we are at each other's throats politically, right? And I didn't want to write another book that was mired in the polarized political discussions that we have these days. I wanted to try to transcend it, first of all. And of course, I didn't want to write like just another palace intrigue or tell-all book about the Trump administration. I think there are plenty of those out there. What I wanted to do was I hope, make a meaningful contribution to understanding the most crucial challenges we face, and then what we need to work on together to overcome those challenges and build a better future for generations to come. And I hope that readers judge the endeavor to have been worthwhile and agree with me that it was better to write this kind of book than another tell-all or palace intrigue book.
Is there any kind of subtle dig at anyone in particular with that note, or just in general?
Illustrations, but I don't think it would be useful to go ad hominem like as so many of these books do these days, right? What can we agree are the biggest challenges we face, and how do we work together? How do we work together to strengthen our nation and to overcome those challenges?
First off, this book is obviously something that you've spent a lot of time working on. We talked about it the last time I was out at Hoover, and there's a lot of different aspects of it I want to pull apart. But one in particular that is on my mind has been this, just because I've had a couple of discussions with some lefty folks over the last couple of weeks. You now have had two administrations, President Obama's and President Trump's, where the person elected essentially ran against America's established foreign policy in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. The criticisms obviously differed, but Americans clearly, responded to those pleas, at least in part. Why do you think it is that even as the American people feel that our foreign policy should shift in different directions, that the overarching kind of established view that you find typically in Washington is not one that lines up with their preferences?
Well, Ben, I think Americans are disappointed. They're disappointed in their foreign policy. It hasn't delivered what they expected, right? We had this period of overconfidence in the 90s, right? Hey, we'd won the Cold War. We had this overwhelming victory over Saddam's army in the 1991 Gulf War, and there was a period during which we thought, okay, we're unchallenged, we're on top. But none of these competitions really went away. And in the early 2000s, of course, we faced a jihadist terrorist enemy who used box cutters and airplanes to commit mass murder in the United States, a devastating loss of almost 3,000 innocent lives, and took trillions of dollars out of the economy. But then we had the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq that had this unanticipated length and cost of those wars. I think were frustrating to Americans. The financial crisis of 2008, the transitions in the global economy that occurred that left many Americans behind. And I think a lot of people thought, hey, these people in Washington, they don't get it. They don't understand what our concerns are. We don't like what the foreign policy is delivering. And so there was this high degree of disenchantment. And this leads to a president who really runs against that establishment, and then in some ways, once he comes into office, goes to war with his own administration at some level, and you see that playing out, I think, even today. So I think what we need is to restore confidence in government. I think that Donald Trump didn't come out of nowhere. These people who are dissatisfied with him, I think they sometimes just focus on him as an individual, when I think what we ought to do is focus on, okay, what produced the Trump movement, and what are the concerns of his supporters that I think our government has to address.
Mhm. The I think if you ask the typical person, what is the reason that we're in Afghanistan today, they would have a hard time answering that question,
Yeah.
particularly post 2011. That basically, after the death of Osama bin Laden, after the early successes and things that were accomplished there, people still don't know why 9 years later there's still a situation where we're in Afghanistan. It's something I even hear from people who served there themselves within my own family. Tell me a little bit about what your answer is to that question.
Well, I mean, the answer is what brought us there to begin with, right? Which is to ensure that Afghanistan never again becomes a place where terrorists can plan, prepare, and execute these mass murder attacks unimpeded. And of course, it's not a theoretical case, right? It happened on September 11th, but it happened in Europe multiple times since then. And of course, you have the Times Square bombing that was foiled, was another attempt to commit mass murder. And what I think Americans have to realize is it's a very dangerous place there, because along that Afghanistan-Pakistan border, there is a jihadist terrorist ecosystem in which these groups share resources and people and expertise and bomb making capability and so forth. And they have access to a narcotics trade that is extremely lucrative, that gives them the financial wherewithal to continue to commit mass murder as their principal tactic in a war against all civilized people. And so Afghanistan is in many ways a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization. And it's worth the effort to support the courageous Afghans who are bearing the brunt of this fight. And so in Battlegrounds, I don't make an argument for, hey, we need like hundreds of thousands of troops in the Middle East, as we have had over the past decades. But what we really do need to do is support those who are doing the bulk of the fighting. So of course we lost 10 courageous servicemen this year in Afghanistan, but every day about 30 Afghan soldiers or police are killed defending the freedoms that they've enjoyed since the end of the Taliban regime in 2001.
Mhm.
And so I think it's worth the effort, and and our safety, our security depends in large measure on us remaining engaged in the way that we're engaged in Afghanistan.
You've obviously gained a reputation as being someone known for your critiques of Army doctrine and practice of wanting reforms within that context. In terms of your, ever since your own experience in feeling the brunt of maybe some backlash to that, has the Army taken any steps to really protect people who are innovative, calling for reforms or changes within its ranks in ways where people can basically offer their ideas, push them forward without fearing a backlash from a system that is notoriously resistant to change?
Ben, I think so. It really varies, right? It varies on who the leaders are. I mean, you hope that leaders at the top create an environment in which they want, they want candid assessments from members of their team, and they want innovative ideas. My experience has been that most leaders do want that kind of frank discussion and recommendations. The army, it's hierarchical. The military is hierarchical, but because the stakes are so high and they involve life and death, right? I mean, most commanders that I've worked for, most leaders I've worked for, hey, they want to hear your suggestions. They want to hear your critiques of policies or doctrine and so forth. So I think it really comes down to who the leader is and the kind of climate and culture that they provide.
Hmm.
You know what? I wrote my first book on how and why Vietnam became an American war, and it focused on the Johnson administration and decisions from 1964, 1963 to 1965. And some of the president's advisors, right? They thought, okay, well, we want to give the president the advice he wants to hear, because if I don't give him the advice he wants to hear, I'm going to lose my influence with the president. Of course, that begs the question, okay, what good is your advice anyway? I mean, what good is your influence anyway if you're not going to tell the president what you think is your best advice? And so I never held back, and I think there's a way to do that in a way that's respectful, and it's a really disservice to any leader if you don't give that leader your frank assessment.
Do you believe that you had strategic influence as national security advisor? And is the job one that really is just difficult to do no matter who's in it? Is there something that should change about that role?
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult job, but I'll tell you, it's a great job. I mean, it's a tremendous challenge, and you can have an immense positive impact, and I think it's a critical role because your job as a national security advisor is unique in that you're the only person in the foreign policy establishment, the national security establishment, who has the president as his or her only client, right? So you have to really help the president be effective in the area of foreign policy and national security. You have really five key tasks, I think, as national security advisor. First of all, you have to staff the president, right? If the president's going to have an engagement on foreign policy or national security, you have to prepare the president for foreign travel, for hosting foreign leaders, for foreign leader phone calls, whatever it is. The second thing you have to do, immensely important, which is run the process. Run a process that ought to be designed to provide the president options for overcoming the most crucial challenges to our security and our prosperity and our influence in the world. And then once the president makes decisions and approves strategies and policies, to assist with the sensible implementation of those decisions. The third thing you have to do is you have to communicate. You have to communicate to relevant audiences. Sometimes on Capitol Hill, sometimes publicly, sometimes international audiences. You want others to do that more the heads of the departments and agencies. But in my case, when you have heads of departments and agencies who are reticent to do so, I mean, I had to do that on occasion. The fourth key task is to maintain good relationships with your counterparts around the world, especially your closest partners and allies, to have unity of effort, to work together, right? Because all of us have certain competitive advantages we want to take advantage of, and then the fifth is you have to lead an organization, right? You have some tremendous young, dedicated men and women on the National Security Council staff who ought to feel like they're part of an organization that is bound together by common purpose, by mutual respect. They want to go to work every day and think they're making a difference, right? And know they're making a difference. And so it's a great job because all of those are really important tasks to accomplish every day. And if you run the process well and you give the president options, my experience was that you get really good policy outcomes. And I think in that first year of the Trump administration, that we implemented a lot of like 180-degree shifts in policy that I think were long overdue. And so yeah, I think it did make a difference. I got used up in the job, Ben. And I was at peace with that, right? I mean, I wasn't going to try to keep my job a day longer than I thought I would be effective. But I was grateful for the opportunity.
Let's talk about those 180-degree shifts. It seems to me like, I mean, I'm sure that you have others that you can speak to as well, but it seems to me like we have to address the relationship with China and how China is perceived, given the shift in administration there. Tell me a little bit about the shift there that happened and how significant it was.
Well, thanks, Ben. This is one of the stories I tell in Battlegrounds is really how we affected what I think is, and I think historians will say, was the greatest shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And what we tried to do, really, with all of these crucial challenges to our security and our prosperity and influence, is to examine the assumptions on which previous policy was based, scrutinize those assumptions, challenge them, and then try to understand these complex challenges on their own terms, using the term that I borrowed from my friend Zachary Shore, strategic empathy, right? Viewing these challenges from the perspective of the other. And when you look at the problem set associated with the Chinese Communist Party, you have to consider what is the ideology, and what are the emotions, what are the aspirations that drive and constrain them. And once you consider that, you realize, hey, we're up against a pretty significant challenge, a challenge that's not going to go away. And this pipe dream that we've had for a long time now, too long, that China, having been welcomed into the international order, is going to play by the rules, is going to liberalize its economy. And over time, as it prospers, it's going to liberalize its form of governance. Well, actually, the opposite is the case. What we concluded is the Chinese Communist Party is driven by fear fear of losing control and therefore is obsessed with control. And this is why you see them extending and tightening their exclusive grip on power. This is why you see them engaged in a campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang, how they're perfecting this Orwellian surveillance police state, why they're repressing freedom in Hong Kong. And they also are driven by this aspiration for national rejuvenation and this hyper nationalist jingoistic propaganda is also associated with that fear of losing control, right? Because what they want to do is replace Maoism with something. You got to replace it with something, right? I mean, it's no longer Maoist communism. It's kind of like the Diet Coke of communism, just 1 calorie, not communist enough, to quote Dr. Evil. And so you have this now drive, for national rejuvenation, the narrative associated with it, and it's very dangerous because now they're exporting this authoritarian model and this mercantilist model in a way that threatens us, that threatens our prosperity. But it's not only a U.S. problem either; it's a free world problem, right? I mean, they're bludgeoning Indian soldiers on the Himalayan frontier. They're engaged with this wolf warrior diplomacy after foisting the virus on the world. They're repressing freedom in Hong Kong. They're engaged in the biggest land grab, in history in the South China Sea. They're threatening Taiwan. It could go on and on. So I think this was important for us to pull the curtain back on, okay, what's motivating them? What are their goals and objectives? How does this place our future at risk? And then what do we have to do to compete, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, everybody talks, hey, we want to cooperate with China. Of course we want to cooperate with China. But unless we compete with them, the door's going to be closed to cooperation, right? Because they're going to just string us along and treat us like we're chumps, Mm-hmm. And so it's an overdue shift, and I'm proud to have been a part in playing, in playing a small role in that shift.
I had a meeting at the White House back in, I guess it was late last year, after I came back from visiting Hong Kong during the protests and everything that were going on there in that period. And at the time, I was pressing them to speak more boldly out on the question and to see what steps could be taken. And one of the things that I heard from a high-level Washington source in that White House official in that meeting was, it's fine to talk about these things, but we're not really in the business of virtue signaling on this type of thing. What are the serious steps that can be taken in regard to the different problems that you've brought up, particularly given the lack of an appetite, I think, on the part of the American people to engage in something that would be potentially very risky in terms of creating a confrontation with China, but at the same time, very real and I think significant and I think beneficial concern, in part highlighted by everything that has gone on in the NBA of all things, right, to the influence that China is having over American domestic life.
Yeah, but Ben, the way I think about this is that the Chinese Communist Party's strategies that they employ against us are really based on three key methods, right? The first is to co-opt us, right? To lure countries into their orbit, companies into their orbit, with either the prospect of profits from access to the Chinese market or Chinese investment, in certain countries. But then once you're in, once they've got you, they coerce you. So it's co-option and coercion. And then the party conceals their aggression by acting like, well, it's just like normal business practices. Well, it's not normal business practices. Mm-hmm. And so what we're doing and what you've seen, I think the Trump administration do effectively is to begin to compete, right? And so you can't blame us for defending ourselves from a sustained campaign of industrial espionage, and from the constant hacking of APT-10, their offensive cyber entity. And so what we've done is we've hardened really our research facilities. We have done a much better job from a counterintelligence perspective. What you saw like in December of 2018, there's this narrative out there, hey, there's no international cooperation. There's really a lot of international cooperation on this problem. When I think it was 12 countries came together and sanctioned APT-10, individuals associated with it. You have a number of other sanctions that are being employed against Chinese companies that are party to this cultural genocide in Xinjiang or the the establishment of this Orwellian police state and the export of it to other countries. I think we have a much better approach to the South China Sea. Just saying, okay, it's a simple message, right? Nobody owns the ocean, okay? So we're gonna continue to sail through there, and I think that's bringing more countries over to our cause, and it's not just the U.S. doing this; it's the Australians, it's the British and the French and the Japanese, right? And so I think competition actually is the best way to avoid confrontation. I think the passive approach we took to China, it really, and with some people arguing, hey, what we really should do is just be managing our decline. Okay, I don't think that's a good strategy, right? We have to compete effectively because China was becoming more and more emboldened, and so I think the policy is sound. It's imperfectly implemented. I mean, like, I don't understand how steel and aluminum tariffs on our allies help us get to China, right? I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. But overall, I think the strategy is headed in the right direction.
Should we explicitly guarantee Taiwan's security?
I don't think it's necessary, right? I think what the administration has done recently, which is making public, the six assurances to Taiwan, some very clear public messaging to China, the visit of Secretary Azar and Undersecretary Keith Kroc from Department of State. I think those are all positive and adequate, as well as in particular the arms sales to Taiwan. Right, Taiwan's got to be able to defend itself, right? And what you really want to do is you want to deter China by denial, right? By convincing China they can't accomplish their objectives through the use of force. And China would be, I think, well advised not to assume that America would respond in kind of a big way if they were to attack Taiwan. I mean, this was the mistake that North Korea made, in June 1950. Well, that's really, Americans aren't going to care what happens on the peninsula. Well, I mean, we did, and so I think it's okay where it is now, Ben. I don't think there's a need to be more explicit about it.
Tell me, let's shift a bit to the experience that we're having in Europe. Tell me a little bit about your perspective on both the president's critique of pre-existing policy toward our European allies, his message about them needing to, pay more of their fair share, as he says it, for their defense, and what our posture ought to be in terms of hedging in Russia in that area and the different choices that were made under this administration. What do you think of those?
Well, I think the president's call for burden sharing, for more contributions to our collective defense is completely appropriate, right? And those calls, those are consistent with calls that go back to the 1970s. And I think that the relationship with our European allies is strained mainly just because of the way they perceive the president's brash nature and that sort of thing. But below the surface of that, there's an increasing recognition that our interests are aligned, that our values are aligned with each other. Russia's done a really good job, Ben, at political subversion within Europe, trying to divide societies, communities, within countries in Europe and between countries across Europe, and then to try to rend, the transatlantic alliance. And I think we have to make a conscious effort to counter that. I think Europe is now waking up, right, to the very pernicious, danger of the Chinese Communist Party. And so there's been some significant reversals, right, in the UK, banning Huawei. This is the company that's going to put in the fifth generation communications infrastructure that would be really a threat to everybody's security and privacy. I think Germany ought to be having second thoughts, right, about China and Russia now, right? You have the poisoning of Navalny, Putin's main adversary, main rival with a nerve agent, and he wound up for medical treatment in Germany, and so the Germans are, well, maybe Nord Stream 2, which is the pipeline that gives Russia, coercive power over the German economy. Well, maybe that's not a good idea, and these are things that the president's been pretty brash and direct about. I think he's right on these issues. So I think it's really time for Europe to strengthen itself. I think you're seeing that now with the European Central Bank. They took some strong action in the wake of COVID, restored some confidence, I think, in the European experiment there. And I think we ought to foster that. I think on the part of the president and some others, there's a tendency to view Europeans as competitors more than allies. Of course they're going to be competitors from an economic perspective, but they are allies, right? We're a club. We're a club of democratic nations who believe, in this idea that people ought to have a say in how they're governed. How about that? That we appreciate rule of law and freedom of speech and religious tolerance, the tolerance of religion, and so I just think I think we need to get over these recent problems that are kind of revolve, I think, around President Trump's personality more than anything else, and reground ourselves in what binds us together.
You write extensively in Battlegrounds about Russia and its impact. It was obviously something that was very important during your tenure. Tell me, what is the threat from Russia that we as Americans underestimate, and what's one that we overestimate? Because it seems like in different areas we make mistakes in different directions.
Right, right. Okay, well, we underestimate how effective they can be at using our own weaknesses against us, right? Using our own divisions against us, right? So,
Mhm.
so right, Russia doesn't, I don't think, care who wins a presidential election. What they want to do is they want to sow doubts in our about our electoral process and in our democracy broadly. They want to use any kind of issue they can to divide us, especially like on race, right? About 80% of their disinformation campaign is aimed at issues of race, to divide us, pit us against each other. No, they also jump on any other issue that can divide us, whether it's kneeling, for the NFL, or if it's or if it's gun control, right, or immigration, and so whenever we are, enmeshed in these partisan, vitriolic, arguments with each other, and not talking about what we do agree on and what we can work on together, Russia loves it. It's great for Russia. And so we underestimate the damage they can do, right? Russia, but then we overestimate sometimes Russia's power in the traditional sense. The Russian economy is about the size of Texas's economy. Yeah, and Vladimir Putin's got some real issues these days, man. I mean, like, COVID hit them hard. They weren't prepared for it. There's a lot of discontent about that. This is supposed to be a big year for old Vladimir Putin, right? A big celebration of the end of the Great Patriotic War. He changed the Constitution so he can stay in power until 2036. But then, it's big disappointment, not only with COVID, but the collapse of oil prices hit them hard. And then there's growing popular discontent within Russia. We've seen that in the East, in particular, in recent months. Belarus, a country that was in his orbit, is spinning out of his orbit. He's putting troops on the border there right now. Actually, it's been underreported. There are two brigades, I think, poised to move into Belarus, Russian brigades. So I think we overestimate that the real power. I mean, in Syria, right? I mean, they're weak in Syria.
Yeah.
But they have some important capabilities, right? If you're into indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations, the Russians are really great at that, right? But they're really not good, I don't think, at what we would call joint military operations. I think militarily they're weak. But then, of course, they've got a huge nuclear arsenal, right? That's a cause for concern, and they're not talking with us about arms control or any kind of confidence building measures these days. You have Putin beats his chest about nuclear weapons, which doesn't make sense to me. That why that is okay behavior, and they have this doctrine of escalation domination, where they threaten first use of nuclear weapons. So it's a dangerous country. But what Russia wants to do is they don't want to outcompete us in these areas. They want to drag us down, right? Putin thinks, hey, if they drag us low enough, that he'll be the last man standing, in Europe in particular.
Talk about what we're seeing right now go on in terms of Middle East relations between UAE and Bahrain and Israel. Both, what was the necessary the previous administration's activity that led to this being even possible, and how important it is in terms of development for the future of the Mideast.
Right, right. I mean, you might recall that the Obama administration mainly defined its foreign policy in opposition to the Iraq War, right? And so the Obama administration saw our disengagement from the Middle East as an unmitigated good, right? The Middle East is just like a mess to be avoided. I think President Trump thinks of it that way sometimes too. I mean, you hear him make these statements about it as well. But what that did is it empowered Iran across the region. I mean, I think you could fairly say that the greatest achievement of the Obama administration's foreign policy was to empower the Iranian regime. And what Iran was pursuing is hegemonic influence across the region as part of this really 40-year-long proxy war that they've been fighting against the United States, the great Satan, Israel, the little Satan, and the Arab monarchies, right? And they apply this kind of Hezbollah model to the region where they have a weak government in power, like in Lebanon, that's dependent on Iran for support, and they grow these militias like Hezbollah that outside of the government's control that can be turned against that government if it acts against Iranian interests, right? You see this in Iraq, you see this what they're trying to do in Yemen, and of course they're enabling the serial episodes and mass murder in the Syrian civil war. And and what the Trump administration did, I think to its credit, is say, okay, well, this is crazy, right? This Iran nuclear deal has given them all the benefits of acting like a responsible nation, but they're not a responsible nation. They're essentially a terrorist sponsor, and so the sanctions being reimposed is immensely important. It's constraining Iran, and I think, the prospect of the U.S. election, the fear that there may be a Democratic, administration that comes in that is more sympathetic again to Iran, that tries to resurrect, the Iran nuclear deal. I think that provides an impetus, for UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain to say, okay, hey, our interests align with Israel more than they, more than we disagree with Israel. And I love the name of the Abraham Accords. I mean, it reminds us all, hey, we're all people of the book, right? And it should be an endorsement of religious tolerance, and if this carries over, Ben, this could be a hugely important development in the Middle East. I don't want to be overly optimistic, but hey, it's so rare that you get good news out of the Middle East. We ought to take a minute to celebrate it, right? And I think it goes back. I think it goes back. I think the Trump administration, this is something they ought to get full credit for, right? I mean, poor Jared Kushner gets bludgeoned all the time in the press, but man, he's stuck with it. He's stuck with it, and it paid off. And if you go back to the president's visit to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, remember it was like, God, what the heck is Donald Trump doing going to Saudi Arabia? That's and he gave this speech followed by King Solomon's speech. I mean, I think read those two speeches. I think there's a lot of promise there, and of course with the Saudis, you always have to say, okay, well, are they going to deliver? Because they were the greatest proselytizers and promoters of this extremist, radical Islamist ideology that was used as a justification, for the heinous acts of terrorism, right? But now they're rejecting it. Okay, well, let's run with that, and let's work with them on isolating terrorist organizations from sources of strength and support. So it's not only countering Iran, but it's also countering these jihadist terrorists by isolating them from not only financial support, but we hope ideological support as well.
I want to ask you, do you think the Arab Street is turned out to be kind of a paper tiger, something that was used by a lot of the figures to sort of say, well, you can't do that. You're going to piss off the Arab Street. The Arab Street's going to do this. It's going to rise up, et cetera. And then it turns out that actually that doesn't have as much of power as we might think when it comes to the ability of these nations to make these kinds of deals with Israel.
Well, and the people of the Arab world have suffered tremendously, right, by serial failures, right? Serial failures of colonialism, right? Then the monarchical period, and then the period of Arab nationalism, and then the period of nationalist dictators, and then this Islamist period of either jihadist terrorists trying to tear down the monarchies or taking over in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which failed. So I mean, look at what's happening in Lebanon. I mean, the state is in complete free fall, and the Arab people are just saying, okay, enough of this, man. They need a real solution to it. And there's also a sense that this sectarianism, right, this use of religion to foment hatred, and to use that hatred to justify violence. They're tired of that as well. I quote in the book my friend Hyder al-Abadi, who was the prime minister of Iraq. He's a real humanist. This guy, he's just a fine person, But he said, hey, sectarianism and corruption go together, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is what Iran tries to use, right? They try to use these Shia Islamist militias to perpetuate a cycle of sectarian violence in the region, and that violence just keeps the Arab world perpetually weak. So they're free to pursue their hegemonic designs. They're free to try to position a proxy army on the border of Israel and threaten Israel with destruction. I think everybody's fed up with this, and they're like,
Mhm.
okay, I mean, we can no longer tolerate this religious extremism and the violence that comes with it.
You conclude your book with a number of interesting points about your critique of the realist school. You write that they found common cause with those who adhere to the New Left interpretation of history, which became more influential in academia during and after the Vietnam War. The realists in the New Left have been bolstered by a large influx of cash from billionaires George Soros and Charles Koch, who share little common ground politically except their advocacy for American retrenchment. Talk to me a little bit about what the realist perspective gets wrong, and why we should be concerned about what it proposes, given the appeal of it in a time when, as we said from the beginning, people are tired of these wars that they see as pointless endeavors or as unending kind of deployment of American lives and resources.
Hey, well, thanks, Ben. First of all, I mean, I respect a lot of these people that are in this so-called realist camp, and you can't. I mean, the labels, they're not that useful sometimes, but these are people who tend to see our disengagement from complex problems overseas as an unmitigated good, and their approach, I don't think it's realistic. It's really an ideological argument, right? Because they apply that argument to everything,
Mhm.
and say, hey, largely because they think we're the problem, overseas, and therefore if we disengage, there won't be jihadist terrorism. Kim Jong Un will be like the Grinch, right? His heart will grow two sizes bigger, and he'll give away all of his nuclear weapons and missiles, right? It's not going to happen. We didn't cause these problems, and if we disengage from them, it makes us less safe, right? And if you think about it, this is an argument that really they try to cast this as a more modest foreign policy, but it's really a profoundly arrogant foreign policy because it assumes that the other, our adversaries and our rivals, have no aspirations except in reaction to us and what we do, right? So the term I use in the book is strategic narcissism.
Mhm.
And this is a tendency on those on the far left, as well as those on in this realist school or whatever, who really define us as the problem, right? And therefore see our disengagement as an unmitigated good. And it's really, it's not a partisan issue, right? Sometimes when you hear some of these people on the so-called realist school who would say they're very conservative, it sounds like some members of the Obama administration throwing their voice. I mean, it's hard to tell the difference. So I think what the American people need is they need to understand what's at stake, right? I mean, why do we care about this problem, and what is the danger to us? What is the opportunity? And then what is a strategy that will achieve a favorable outcome for the United States at an acceptable cost? A really sound strategy, and that's the argument I make in the book: is that we have to restore our strategic competence as the first step in building our confidence in an effective foreign policy and an effective, sustained, long-term foreign policy.
We are speaking in a moment of degradation of faith in institutions, and it's not just confined to one area. Basically, every major institution of public life has seen their support crumble. The level of trust for media, Congress, the community organizations, even the church and sports leagues, it just has collapsed over the last several decades. I think you can determine when that started, but Vietnam's a good point. The experience has really left the American military as being the one institution that still has the enormous faith and trust of the American people. And yet I do feel like they also see some separation there in terms of what they might want, whether you're on the left or the right, in terms of our foreign policy and the way that our military is used and the way that it actually is used. You talked about the gap that the president found when he arrived in Washington between what he was wanting and asking for and getting into fights with his own administration. How can Americans have faith that our armed forces are going to be able to do the things they want them to do, which I don't think is, the kind of extreme pullback you've just mentioned, but also uses American resources where they're most needed, most necessary, and where we believe that victories can actually be achieved.
Yeah, right. Well, I think that we have to improve our understanding of of armed conflict, of war, right? And what I write about in the book is, we always fall into this trap of thinking, okay, really, really, the next politics, right? We have to be able to consolidate military gains to get to that sustainable outcome. It's not an optional phase of war. You've got to be able to do it. I mean, what was interesting to me is that the Obama administration came in and said, hey, we're not going to repeat the mistakes of the George W. Bush administration like they did in Iraq. Well, then they actually exceeded them in Libya right,
Hmm.
by removing Gaddafi and then doing nothing to
Hmm.
shape the political environment. And then war's human. People fight for fear, honor, and interest, like Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago. And so, unless you're addressing those drivers of conflict, you're only treating the symptoms, right? I mean, counterterrorism can't just be a whack-a-mole targeting exercise. We've got to really get at what's driving conflict and what are the sources of strength and support for these terrorist organizations. And then, I think, really most importantly, war's uncertain because the enemy has a say in the future course of events. I mean, in recent years, Ben, we've announced years in advance, exactly the number of troops we're going to have, what our withdrawal timeline is. That's crazy. I mean, if the great captains of history were to come back and look at what we're doing, they think we're nuts, and then finally, war's a contest of wills. And this gets to your earlier question. It's really important to explain to the American people, what is the strategy?
Hmm.
I think Americans are willing to sacrifice. Certainly, our courageous, men and women in our armed forces are, but they want to be assured that the risks that we're taking, the sacrifices that we're making, are contributing to an outcome worthy of those risks and sacrifices.
Hmm. The book is Battlegrounds: The Fight to Defend the Free World. General McMaster, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Hey, Ben, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, and thanks for this great podcast. It's a real service. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, boys and girls, we will be back soon with more at the Federalist Radio Hour. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.